So I love this topic. I think there's a lot that that I, as a physician, I'm concerned when people talk about fasting. So what I want to do today is to give you an idea what fasting is, what are the forms of fasting that have been used, that we're still using today, and what should you be careful, what you might decide to do, but in a safe way. There's a lot of really interesting research on fasting, and I'll tell you why that is and the reason for fasting. So, we as human beings have been fasting since ever, forever, since millennia. Um, First, because there was not always food. We had food scarcity, and also because of some religious events or rituals, or, sometimes for penance. I'm Catholic, so that's pretty common in Catholic faith. Perhaps we think that the first physician to introduce fasting as a form of treatment, as a way to improve well-being, was Hippocrates. And he was a Greek physician who is thought to be the father of medicine and lived in the 400 or so BCE. Of course, between Hippocrates until then came Jason Fung, who is probably the person who popularized intermittent fasting. There had been a lot of research, but it really wasn't something that we thought of something to do, right? Again, Dr. Fung, a Canadian nephrologist, was the one who really made it popular for people to do at least this intermittent fasting. So what are the styles of fasting? What is fasting? So you can think of fasting as simple as reducing calories. That is called calorie restriction. Of course, you can restrict calories a little bit, or you can restrict them a lot. And if you talk about these very low calorie diets, those are up to 800 calories per day. Now, I have to say, this in studies have been done through meal replacements. I'm not advocating you do meal replacement. I'm just telling you how this has been done. So usually they were done with the help of a health coach or with a physician. So there are several programs. And again, they're all meal replacement programs. So Medifast is probably the oldest one. I'll show you some data on it. Optavia is actually part of the same company, but it's the one that people are using now, and that has a health coach component. And then the ones that physicians can direct is the group, the method called OptiFast. Intermittent fasting, which is again this very popular form introduced by Jason Fung in the 2000s. That actually is two forms of fasting. So one is what we call alternate day fasting, and the other one is what we call time-restricted feeding. So they're both part of what we call intermittent fasting. I think when most people talk about intermittent fasting, they are talking about the alternate days. But both the alternate days and the time-restricted feeding are both part of the intermittent fasting. There are also many variants to this, and we'll talk about them as well. One that I've become to really be very intrigued by, and is one that I actually use in my practice, is the fasting mimicking diet. And that was coined by a researcher in California, Walter Longo. Of course, when they did the studies so that everybody had the same diet, there was a company called Prolon who provided them with those foods. And again, it's almost like, it's not really a meal replacement, but it's foods that are made into a packet. Of course, Prolon now has its own company, and they sell products. Again, I don't recommend products. I recommend people do this with food, not with something that comes from a packet. I don't care who makes the packet. If it comes in a packet, that's processed. And there are other styles of fasting, and those are usually combinations of the above. So somebody decided to combine calorie restriction with intermittent fasting, and there's a study about that, and I'll show you that. And somebody thought about doing the fasting mimicking diet, FMD for short, with a high fiber component. By itself has high fiber, but they decided to put a bit more fiber. And that was a study for people who had type 2 diabetes, and I'll show you that as well. So let's talk about the very low calorie diet. And again, I'm not telling you that you do it. I'm just telling you what the data shows and what would you expect if you were to decide to do this. So there was a study in 2016 where they looked at a very low calorie diet for people with type 2 diabetes. There were not many people in the study. There were 30. And what they did was to give them 8 weeks of this very low calorie diet. And that was again with meal replacement. They had for 2 meals of the day and snacks, they had meal replacement. So again, it was a shake in a packet, or it was a soup that it was again in a packet that you actually had to mix with water. And they also have them do 1 meal a day was just a vegetable meal made at home. And again, that was between 600 to 700 calories, which is very, very low. They did that for 2 months. And after 2 months, they went on a normal calorie diet for 6 months. To me, the interesting part about this study was that these people with type 2 diabetes, almost half of them resolved their diabetes. They didn't have diabetes any longer by numbers, right? Not only that, but the average weight loss was about 15 pounds. And they lost that in the first 8 weeks, the first 2 months, but then they kept that over the next 6 months. Again, this type programs like OptiFast, which is supervised by a physician, MediFast, and Optavia. Optavia is a little bit higher calories. It's still low calorie, but it's not as low as the 600-700. It goes up the way up to 1,000 calories. All these very low calorie diets have a lot of protein, usually more than what you would find in a normal diet. They also have high fiber, and they don't really restrict carbohydrates. Even Optavia, which, and let me sort of rephrase that a little bit. In our diet, we probably, the average diet has higher amount of carbohydrates than 80 to 100. Less than 100 is considered actually a low carbohydrate diet. Okay, so this is a low carbohydrate diet. And all of them, again, Optavia or MediFast, have this health coaching part. So there are benefits to calorie restriction, and I'm not just saying for very low calorie, but anytime you decrease calories, you lower your weight, at least for the short term. In the short term, you have improved blood pressure and you have better blood sugar regulation, which are all things that are good for our heart health and our cardiovascular health, right? Can you do this at home? Well, you cannot do the very low calorie diet. I don't think anybody can really do that low without really getting into trouble, because you will start to miss some nutrients. But could you do something similar? Could you do a calorie restriction? Yeah, you can do a vegan diet. Vegan diets are usually, in general, lower calorie. Of course, as long as you don't put pizza in your vegan, or you don't put, even a Chinese meal, even if it's a vegetable Chinese meal, it's going to have a lot of calories and a lot of, other things that you don't want to have. But in general, vegan diet will give you lower calories. And could you do it for a month or two, right? And I put a question mark because at the end we'll talk about timing for this when you're trying to change your diet. You could also increase the amount of fiber in your diet. That would also help you not just with weight, but also help with sugar regulation as well as with cholesterol. So all the things that the other studies show that you will have an improvement in. You could also decrease the foods that you have with added sugars. So whether that's your cake or your cookie or your glass of wine or anything that has added sugars, you could actually decrease that. That by itself will decrease calories. You can also work with a health coach. You will do, again, that program was not only restricting calories, it was also working with a health coach. So there were two aspects to the program. So you could do something like that, or some aspects of it at home that are, I think, beneficial, even if the whole program by itself might not be. The drawback of the study was that, or any very low calorie diets, over time, and this is usually after a year, many of the people who were in the study regained the weight that they had lost. So it didn't really last for as long as we would have wanted it. Let's switch gears. Let's talk about intermittent fasting. So again, this was popularized by Jason Fung. So what is intermittent fasting? It's basically alternating days or times when you eat and when you fast. And that eating pattern, that either is going to be hours or days. And those hours or days are going to have either no or minimal food. But this is the key, without deprivation of essential nutrients. All right, this is not eating nothing. This is eating less. So eating less, sometimes it's not eating, but when you don't eat, it's because you're eating other times of the day. So I'll explain that a little bit more. So with an intermittent fasting, you have those two modes: alternate day fasting, time restricted feeding. Alternate day fasting is either that, alternate days. So one day you eat more, one day you eat less. One day you eat more, one day you eat less. 5-2, so 2 days of the week you eat less, 5 days you eat your normal amount, or 3 times a week. So instead of alternating days, you just say, okay, well, these 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm gonna just eat less, and the other days I'm gonna eat my usual. The time-restricted feeding is something you do daily, and that is restricting the hours you eat. So it's eating only during a 4 or 6 hour window. Up to 10 hours, there have been studies showing some benefit, and I'll show you that as well. So it's restricting how many hours you eat in a day. It's not restricting what you eat. So you still have your 3 meals a day, right? What I see a lot of people doing is that they'll do an alternate day fasting along with a time-restricted feeding. So they will not eat for, they will only eat for about 4 hours, but those 4 hours they're actually only eating, one meal. That's not really one or the other. That's something else that people are doing in an attempt, most of the time, to lose weight. And I'll tell you how I think that's actually a bit dangerous to do. This is a slide just to show you the many benefits, if you wish, or the changes that happen both when you restrict calories, that's the dietary restriction, and when you do an intermittent fasting. So this is a complicated slide. There are many things here. I just want you to take a look at two things. So if you look here, this is what your cells are seeing. And in your cells, there's more energy. Your insulin, works better. You actually start to mobilize fat, which is what you want to do when you try to lose weight. All this actually helps your cells work better. Including this means that you're making more connections in your brain. So synapses is the connection between nerves in the brain. And that improves with this, both with calorie restriction as well as with intermittent fasting. So that translates, when you talk about how your body works, your physiology, into protection for your nervous system, sugar control, this is sugar regulation. It does increase cortisol, which is your stress hormone, but it's thought to be a protective mechanism. Over time, what it really does is to allow you to be more resistant to stress in your body. It's like your body's more prepared to take on stresses. And as we said, it improves or decreases how much fat mass you have in your system. So there are some benefits that definitely we see at a cellular level, right? And how our bodies work. So how does this work? How does fasting work, and what do we think is beneficial? Well, anytime you fast, even if it's just 6 or 8 hours, you're going to switch. You're going to induce this metabolic switch. And instead of using glucose or sugar, you're going to use ketones for energy. So in a way, whenever you fast, it's almost like you're doing a ketogenic diet, right? It has part of that component that ketogenic diets do. And again, ketogenic diets, for those of you who are not familiar, it just involves eating increased amount of fats, very low amount of carbohydrates to allow your body to not burn glucose or sugar or carbohydrates, but to burn fat. So this is sort of done a little bit with this anytime you fast. Not only that, but you're going to increase how your fat tissue metabolizes itself. So you're going to break down a little bit of the fat tissue, right? Because that's what you're going to be using for energy. That helps your weight, that helps your cholesterol. We think from very early studies that it actually may allow us to live longer. That's what longevity means. And it also may allow us to decrease risk of some conditions like cancer and obesity. It's possible that intermittent fasting might be a better choice than a ketogenic diet if you're looking at heart disease. Even if you were to fast only 1 day a month, that actually might be beneficial. And that perhaps is not that difficult to do. We also know that fasting lowers inflammation. And if you know, and if you don't, I'll tell you, inflammation is what we think is at the core of many of our chronic conditions. So whether you talk about diabetes, or you talk about obesity, or you talk about heart disease, osteoporosis, at the core is inflammation. So if fasting lowers inflammation, we think that over time, fasting will also improve those conditions or prevent them, at least. And if your fasting is of the kind when you do the time-restricted feeding, so again, eating for a short amount of time in the day, that is going to restore circadian rhythm. And there's something about the circadian rhythm that it really is important for our well-being and our health. There have been a lot of concern about disrupted circadian rhythms and how that can affect cancer and other conditions, right? Diabetes. So another benefit. So what are those benefits? What do you see? So we definitely see in most of the studies, not all, there's an improvement in sugar control. So in some studies, it doesn't get to show that sugar gets better. Weight for sure goes down, especially with people who are obese. And the amount of weight that I gathered from different studies was anywhere from 8 pounds to 20 pounds after about 8 to 12 weeks. And it also, because it lowers inflammation, right? We know that. Because it does all these things, it lowers blood pressure, lowers blood glucose, it improves cholesterol, it improves your weight. In the end, intermittent fasting is going to improve cardiovascular health. That's what you're going to see, and as a benefit. This is the key part to me. Alternating fasting cycles and refeeding, not just the fasting, is what helps. Chronic restriction may not be effective or as effective than alternating. So you want to alternate fasting with refeeding. That's really the key, not just chronic fasting, which is what a lot of people, I think, end up doing when they go into an intermittent fasting protocol. This is the other form of intermittent fasting. This is what we call time-restricted feeding. And this is, instead of eating 12 hours a day, which we normally eat, sometimes even longer if we have a snack after dinner, this actually is eating for a short amount of time. And this study was actually early in the day, and I'll tell you why that's important. So time-restricted feeding is really limiting your food intake to about 6 to 10 hours in a 24-hour cycle. So when the studies compare eating 10 hours to anything that is 14 hours or more, if you eat 10 hours, you're going to improve your weight, your sleep, and your energy. And that's pretty simple, right? If you eat within 6 hours, and that's compared to 12 hours, that also improves your weight, your insulin, again, what you use to metabolize sugar, improves blood pressure, and your appetite. What is interesting is that if you eat during the middle of the day, that's going to lead you to more weight loss, better sugar control, and lower inflammation. However, if you eat after 4 p.m., not only you don't do any better, you actually do worse. You get worse sugar control, worse blood pressure, and worse lipids. And this is perhaps, I think, one of the concerns that I have when people do intermittent fasting of the kind when they're only eating dinner. For some people, especially if you're looking for sugar control, that might not be as beneficial. You might actually, and again, it's a little hard because, at least in this country, we tend to eat dinner around here. If you're living in Spain, as long as you don't go out to party with your friends at 10 o'clock at night, which many of us used to do when I lived in Spain. But if you eat normally, this is when you eat. You eat up to about, 2. If you eat late, like in my house, you might eat until up to 4 p.m., but usually not later than that. So that is what we think is really, truly beneficial, is eating in this early part of the day. So let's say that you cannot do this because, you have a family, you all like to sit down for dinner, which I think is really important for social connections and other reasons. But because we know that when we eat is as important as what we eat, and our body metabolism changes, if you're going to have a piece of bread, I'm not saying you do, but if you do, eat it at breakfast. It's not going to give you as much sugar, and it's not going to be as fattening as if you eat the same thing in the evening. All right. So if you cannot do this, at least you can do this. And that just by itself might be beneficial. This is a comparison between intermittent fasting and calorie restriction. And again, this wasn't really the very low calorie, it's just anytime you restrict calories. So the difference is, when you restrict calories, that's all you're doing. You're lowering your calories, but it doesn't really give you any of that ketone formation. It's not sync with your circadian rhythm. And this one, we definitely know that you will lose weight regardless of what your initial weight. This is BMI, for body mass index. So it's a way to measure, how much you weigh. Intermittent fasting, on the other hand, it is centered around time-restricted eating. So whether it's days or hours, there's a time component to it. It is going to promote some of those ketone formations, which we think is actually beneficial. It is linked, especially if you do the time-restricted feeding, to the circadian biology, which we think is beneficial. Intermittent fasting, definitely the weight loss is more pronounced if you are somebody who has a high BMI, if you have high weight. And it's probably a little bit easier to do for the long term than actually restrict calories. This is a little bit harder to do in the long term. Both of them are going to improve your stress, your blood pressure, insulin, and cholesterol. Similar for weight loss, similar for cholesterol, but we think that intermittent fasting might be a little bit better for fasting glucose. And again, not all the studies on intermittent fasting have shown that glucose improves, but in the ones that do, they're better than calorie restriction. So if you're looking for glucose regulation, this might be a better option for you than this one. Let's talk about the fasting mimicking diet. And again, this was something that was invented, if you wish, by Walter Longo in California. It's a plant-based diet. It's low calorie, low protein, low carbohydrate. That is very high in your healthy fats. So both poly and mono unsaturated fats. So the unsaturated, which are the healthy fats. And he calls it a fasting mimicking diet because it's almost like you're water fasting, right? You're not just eating water or drinking water, you're eating. It's done 5 consecutive days, once a month, and at least 3 months, but up to a year. And I'll give you, there's one that is a little bit different. It's a modification of this one. And really, the data from this diet is really, really intriguing in how it improves sugar metabolism, gut microbiome, and it lowers inflammation. These are all the benefits that have been shown to date from this fasting mimicking diet. Again, these 5 days of a vegan diet. It improves mitochondrial function, and mitochondria are the energy centers of our cells. It's actually where you get your energy. Very interestingly, when we talk about chronic conditions, whether it's chronic fatigue or diabetes or actually thyroid disease, at the core, there seems to be some mitochondrial dysfunction. So it makes sense that if you do this diet, that you improve mitochondrial function, that you would improve those conditions. There's some data that it also allows your pancreas to make actually better insulin, to make more insulin, to regenerate insulin, which is really, really amazing. It lowers body weight, blood pressure, blood sugar, and this has been shown both in people who are healthy, in those with type 2 diabetes, and also in those with pre-diabetes. No matter who you look at, sugar levels get improved. You also improve metabolic parameters, types of fat, and this marker for inflammation in your sort of like metabolic inflammation, your cells inflammation improves that as well. So lower inflammation, which is what you see here. So how do you do this in practice? What do you do if you're really interested in doing any one of this? What would this look like if you were to take this home? So the alternate day type of intermittent fasting is alternating either every 24 hours or doing it 2 or 3 times a week. And fasting usually involves eating about 25% of what you eat on your non-fasting days. So you eat normally on your non-fasting days, and the days when you fast is about 25%. Some, and again, this is not what everybody does, but some of the studies, what they've done is that on fasting days, you only eat dinner, and on non-fasting days, you eat lunch and dinner. Time-restricted feeding, again, this is just when you change how many hours you're eating per day. And you can do an early time-restricted feeding, and that will mean that you eat breakfast around 8. Dinner is definitely done by 4, so your lunch is somewhere in between. And again, you're not restricting your calories or how many meals you're eating per day. You're still eating your 3 meals a day. If you eat 3 meals, you're only changing the time when you're consuming those meals. So you're shortening the window when you're eating. And then non-early just means that, which is what a lot of people do, which is because it's easier to have dinner by 7 p.m. with your family, is moving breakfast all the way down to 11. And then having lunch somewhere between, around 3, I guess, or a snack, if not a full lunch. The fasting mimicking diet, that again is eating vegan diet for 5 consecutive days. But the emphasis here is to have lots of those healthy fats, nuts, seeds, avocados, olives, and olive oil. All those are really big in this protocol. You also make sure you have enough fluid. And that's because, as you probably know, when you start any sort of fasting, you're probably going to lose a bit of that water weight, we call. So the diet is pretty big in having soups and also teas throughout the day. You can definitely modify it. And this was one study where they actually modified this diet to include other fiber-rich foods. So they actually include oats in this one particular study, and they use herbs like bitter melon. It's actually not an herb, it's another fruit, but it's used as an herb. And this was a study in people with diabetes. So they wanted to give them more fiber and also use something which has been used in India. This was an Indian study. In India, bitter melon is an herb. We also use it in this country, but it comes from India for sugar control. There's another modification for the fasting mimicking diet, and it's a 7, instead of 5 days, this was 7 consecutive days. And they follow that by a Mediterranean diet for 6 months. This was a study in patients who had multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is a disease of the nervous system, and is a disease that is thought to be of the immune system as well as the nervous system. So it talks about immunity, which is why some people who have autoimmune conditions are doing a protocol like this. So some people with autoimmune conditions will do 7 days twice a year. It's sort of one modification of this diet. Not a lot of data, I'm just going to say, but really the data is in this MS study, not data for other autoimmune conditions. It's just worth sort of like saying, if it works for this, it probably will work for autoimmune conditions, because it decreases inflammation and improves the autoimmunity in the body, lowers autoimmunity. These are the other fasting methods, and this is one that I just want to mention because I think it's important to know. It wasn't really that, I don't think it was that beneficial beyond what intermittent fasting or restricting calories will do, but they combine both. So it was combining intermittent fasting and calorie restriction. So when they did intermittent fasting, it was 1 day a week, and that day all they had was a vegetable juice that was 120 calories. That was it. And the other days when they had a calorie restriction, those 6 days, they either used food or a meal replacement, but all they had was 240 calories for breakfast, 240 for lunch, and 400 to 600 for dinner. And that's pretty low. I'm not somebody who really looks at calories when I eat. I just look at more of the content of my food, but I sort of for fun, I said, well, let me see what I do in a day. In one of my vegan days, when I had oatmeal, my oatmeal had 260 calories. I actually had lasagna for lunch, and it was vegetarian, but it had cheese, and that was 370. And then I had dinner, and my dinner was close to 700. So you can do this with food. Now I'm going to tell you, after 8 weeks, yes, their sugar was better. Yes, their cholesterol was better, but they didn't lose that much weight. So after 8 weeks, one group lost up to 7 pounds, and that's when they use a meal replacement, and the other one lost 6 pounds. So definitely don't do this with meal replacement. I don't think it's worth doing. Not that I would ever advocate for meal replacement, but it doesn't seem to be much better. But it does help with sugar, it helps with cholesterol. I think it's a bit strict in my mind. So if we look at the benefits, could one model be good for you? So if you're looking at this saying, okay, well, I really want to just lose some weight. All right. So just remember that most of the studies we have are short term. And we know that definitely short term, any of these methods will help you lose weight. Perhaps I think the best is actually with calorie restriction, but you have to really be very strict. And I think that's really hard to do. It definitely helps when you decrease carbohydrates. But if you do an early time restricted eating, that's going to help your weight. And I think that's it's an easier way of doing it. And you're not really restricting calories as much, which I'll tell you what my concern with that is in a minute. If you're looking for sugar control, I really would recommend you do either an early time restricted feeding. You could do the very low calorie diet if that's what you really want for 2 months, especially if you have diabetes, or that you use the Walter Longo protocol. I think all of them have shown to be beneficial. And again, my thought would be either this one or these ones, because you can do them with food at home. If you have cardiac disease, the studies definitely seem promising for intermittent fasting. Even if you were to fast only for 24 hours, 1 day a month might be beneficial. So that would be something that you could consider. For neurological conditions, I wrote here intermittent fasting seems promising, but I think the Walter Longo protocol also seems promising to me just because of that study with patients with multiple sclerosis. In that study, they had compared the Walter Longo, the 5-day vegan, with a ketogenic diet, which has been used in patients with neurological conditions. And the Walter Longo did as well as the ketogenic diet. So I think these are different ways of fast and actually improve our body's workings. What are the risks of fasting, and when should you think twice about fasting? So if you do one of these very low calorie programs, so the ones that have the meal replacement, that has a risk for gallstones. If you do intermittent fasting for a very, very long term, the concern is that over time, you actually could have worse sugar regulation, and you could also release some damaging chemicals from tissues. This is from animal studies. To me, I think that this probably is more likely to happen if you're one of those people who do intermittent fasting when you're really only eating one meal per day, every day. So you're combining the time restricted feeding. You're only eating for about 3 or 4 hours in a day. Most people actually eat only like even an hour in a day. And then they keep doing that every single day. That, I think, is when this happens. If you alternate, I think this is less likely to happen. And this is a concern. If you lose a lot of body fat, you're going to decrease your sex hormones. So sex hormones have come from fat. And that in women will lead to irregular cycles, loss of cycles completely, even bone thinning if we're thinking about, osteoporosis. And in men, it will just decrease their sex drive, their libido, right? If you're taking medications, either for blood pressure or for blood sugar, you should know that your doses might need to be decreased, or you actually might need to stop medication. So you need to talk to your physician if you're thinking of doing any one of these fasting protocols. Don't take it lightly, because if your sugars go down, that's dangerous. Same with your blood pressure. This is what I think will be really important to consider, is make sure that we're talking about fasting, which is a little bit of a form of starvation, right? It's a healthy starvation versus malnutrition. And there's a balance, and we want to make sure that we don't really tip it over to malnutrition. So fasting should be done in cycles, not daily. Again, remember this, what I said before, there really is the alternating, not the chronic restriction. If you fast for a long term, you're going to end up being malnourished, and that's when your body's going to begin to malfunction. So you have, hair loss in women, poor sleep, irregular cycles, low libido. You might feel lethargic. You might actually have no appetite, and that's actually a sign that you're starting to get into this malnutrition. I put this slide just to show you what I think is sort of the optimal time to eat. So starvation is like fasting, right? You're not eating. And again, in the past, this was done because you didn't have food. So when your body didn't have any food, it will trigger some brain centers that will make you be hungry, and they will make you go foraging for food, right? That's sort of what our body does. Now we do this now on purpose. So when we start to fast, we go up in our metabolism. This is your basic metabolic rate. So it goes up a little bit above normal. But just look at this, after 1 to 2 days, or probably 2 days, you start to go down in your metabolic rate. If you decrease your metabolic rate, A, you're not going to lose weight. B, you're going to be more tired, right? Metabolic rate is what allows you to carry on with the functions of your body. Now think of protein malnutrition. And again, this was times when people didn't have protein, or you were decreasing your protein intake. And again, that's going to trigger some signaling in the body that's going to make you want to eat or look for protein. This is similar to what I think of the Walter Longo protocol, is that low protein diet. So here, he actually does it for about 5 or so days. So it's exactly here. You increase your metabolism, and as soon as you're done here, he actually stops the 5-7 days, and you go back and eating normally. So right before you go down into the low metabolism. All right, so there's a reason why these people chose to either do alternate day fasting, or they did the 5 to 7 days of the low protein diet. Now, this is not something that any of us want. This is something that we probably cannot even induce ourselves. We don't want to induce this. This is what happens when the body has bad conditions like cancer. When the body actually has an increased metabolic rate, which is why we lose so much muscle, because it pulls from our muscle, and then over time we go down. I don't think this will happen if you fast for a long time, but it's my concern that over time you actually do this if you don't eat at all. And then, of course, you get very, very fatigued. So what is my summary? What is what I want you to take home with you? Well, first, I want you to eat smart. So if you're going to eat well. Make your own meals as much as you can. Include lots of vegetables, and make those vegetables as varied as possible. So I've told many people, I love this research where this man encourages people to eat 50 different kinds of vegetables every week. I think that's tremendous, because it improves it's not so much of an anti-inflammatory effect, which they do have an anti-inflammatory effect, so it lowers inflammation, but also improves your gut microbiome, that gut diversity that really is then linked to all of our metabolic functions. Now, if you decide on a fasting method, make sure you're not starving. And by that, I mean you're not really malnourished. Otherwise, you're going to turn off your healthy metabolism. And then the problem is that every time you want to try to go on a diet and you're trying to lose weight, you can't, because you already turn off your metabolism and you've already reduced that metabolic rate. So if you're going to fast, do it alternated, right? And do it very quickly. So fasting should be done for short periods of time. So if you're going to do it up to 18 hours in a 24-hour day, without eating less, All right. So 18 hours fasting means that you still have 6 hours to eat. You're still going to be eating your 2 or 3 meals a day. You're not going to restrict what you're eating. You can do it 2 days a week. You can do it 1 day a month. It should be in for short periods of time. And just be careful of fasting and restricting calories for long periods of time. If you're doing this 20 to 24-hour fast every day, that's going to bring your body into hibernation. And I'll be able to tell you because I'll look at your thyroid hormones and I'll say, aha, your body's hibernating. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I hope that you will be safe if you decide to do some sort of fasting. Thank you.